On a quiet winter morning in early 1999, Yosemite National Park looked peaceful from the outside, but something dark was moving beneath the surface, something no one could see, something no one could imagine. Tourists were arriving for what they believed would be a beautiful vacation, a break from the noise of life, a chance to be surrounded by nature. Among them were Carol Sund, her teenage daughter Julie, and Julie's friend Silvina Palazzo. They'd checked into the Cedar Lodge like thousands of families before them, unaware that a predator was watching, waiting, and planning. His name was Cary Stayner, and what made him terrifying was not just what he did, it was how ordinary he appeared. He wasn't the wild-eyed monster people expected. He was the quiet handyman, the man who held the door open, the man who fixed air conditioners, the man who smiled politely and blended into the background like a harmless shadow. But behind that calm face was a childhood filled with trauma, loss, and a growing darkness that would eventually explode into violence. Cary Stayner grew up in a house full of sadness, confusion, and silence. His younger brother, Stephen Stayner, had been kidnapped when Cary was a child. While the world focused on Stephen's miraculous escape 7 years later, no one noticed Cary slipping deeper into the background. Stephen became the hero of the family. Cary became invisible. Psychologists later said this emotional starvation left a hole inside him that never healed. He grew up feeling overshadowed, ignored, and unimportant. By the time he became an adult, his mind had already begun to twist, shaped by years of isolation, jealousy, and fantasies he never shared with anyone. He started imagining violent scenarios from a very young age, long before he acted on them. These dark fantasies became his escape, his comfort, his secret world. And by the time he reached his 30s, those fantasies were no longer enough. He wanted the real thing. When Cary took a job as a handyman at Cedar Lodge, it was like giving a wolf the keys to a sheep farm. He had access to every room. No one questioned him. He was friendly, reliable, and quiet. And that's exactly how he wanted to appear, because quietly, he was keeping track of who came through the lodge, which rooms were full, which guests were young, which doors were easy to access, which nights were quiet. It wasn't impulsive, it wasn't sudden, it was planned. He waited for the moment that felt right, and on February 15th, 1999, he found it. That night, Carol Sund and the two girls settled into room 509, unaware that someone was watching them from the shadows. Cary approached the room with the calmness of a man who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in his head. There was no rage, no panic, only control. He used his master key to enter, and what happened inside that room set off a chain of events that would shock America. The three women vanished. No one knew where they went. Their rental car disappeared. Their belongings seemed untouched. At first, authorities thought maybe the family had taken an unplanned trip into the mountains. But when days passed with no sign of them, fear began to spread. News vans came, reporters arrived, search teams combed the forests, the FBI got involved. And through all of this, Cary Stayner walked around the property calmly, even asking reporters, "Do you think they'll find them?" No one suspected him. Why would they? He wasn't acting nervous, he wasn't hiding, he wasn't running. He was blending in with the concern around him, watching the investigation unfold like a spectator at his own crime scene. Weeks later, the charred remains of Carol's rental car were discovered deep in the woods. Inside, investigators found 2 bodies burned beyond recognition. DNA confirmed it was Carol and Silvina. The discovery stunned the nation and ignited a massive manhunt for whoever was responsible. But where was Julie? She wasn't in the car, and that unanswered question terrified everyone. The search intensified, helicopters hovered, volunteers scoured the trails, officers knocked on cabin doors. And Cary helped tourists with directions, changed light bulbs, and mowed grass like nothing had happened. The entire country was watching. Parents hugged their daughters tighter. Yosemite, once a symbol of peace, was now a landscape of fear. But the truth was far more chilling than anyone imagined, because the killer was standing right in front of them the entire time. The case took a disturbing turn when an anonymous letter arrived at the FBI office. It contained a map, a hand-drawn clue, and a single sentence: "We had fun with this one." The map led investigators to the body of 15-year-old Julie Sund, left miles away from where her mother and friend were found. The brutality of the crime stunned seasoned agents. This wasn't random. It was deliberate, organized, controlled. The killer hadn't panicked. He had taken his time. That alone told the FBI they were dealing with someone extremely dangerous. And still, no one suspected Cary Stayner. Until one mistake changed everything. Months after the Sund and Peloso murders, a young naturalist named Joey Armstrong was found brutally murdered near Yosemite. Witnesses spotted a blue vehicle near the scene. That clue led to investigators to the one person they had never considered: the quiet handyman, Cary Stayner. When they approached him for questioning, he didn't run. He didn't resist. Instead, he did something no one expected. He confessed, not just to Joey's murder, but to everything, every detail, every moment. He spoke calmly, almost relieved, as if he had been waiting to let the secret out. When investigators first heard Cary Stayner's voice over the phone on that hot July afternoon in 1999, they had no idea they were speaking to the man who had haunted Yosemite for months. The search for the missing naturalist, Joey Armstrong, had just begun, and the task force was scrambling for leads. But now, out of nowhere, Cary was asking if he could talk to an agent. His tone sounded calm, too calm for someone claiming to help. And yet, no one suspected that this soft-spoken motel handyman was about to confess to one of the most chilling murder sprees in modern California history. Detectives met Cary at the Laguna del Sol nudist resort, where he had checked in after disappearing from his job at Cedar Lodge. When they walked up to confront him, Cary didn't run. He didn't panic. Instead, he lifted his hand slowly and said, "I know what you're here for." Those words hit the agents like a punch. Killers usually deny everything. Cary was ready to talk. Inside the interview room, he sat down quietly, almost politely. There was no shaking, no sweating, no signs of fear. He looked like a man relieved to finally take a weight off his chest. And then he said the words no one expected: "I'm guilty. I killed all of them." Investigators froze. They didn't even know what all of them meant yet. Cary started with the murders of Carol Sund, her teenage daughter Julie, and Julie's friend, Argentine exchange student Silvina Peloso. He described their arrival at Cedar Lodge, how he had watched them walk to their room, and how something inside him snapped. For years he had fantasized about killing, but this time he acted on those fantasies. He broke into their room, tied them up, and carried out his darkest impulses while pretending he was in control. The details he gave were so specific, so horrifying, that agents had to pause the interview multiple times just to process the reality of what they were hearing. He told them he strangled Carol first, then Silvina. But Julie, he kept her alive long enough to terrorize her on a drive into the mountains before killing her and leaving her body near Lake Don Pedro. Detectives listening had to keep their emotions in check. They were trained to stay calm, but nothing prepares you for hearing a killer narrate cruelty with such emotional distance. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pleasure, it was almost emptiness. Then, as if he were talking about a separate incident entirely, Cary casually moved on to Joey Armstrong. He said he had spotted her near her cabin, followed her into the woods, and attacked her, without hesitation.
Again, his voice lacked emotion. It was the kind of tone someone uses when explaining how they fixed a broken appliance. That detachment made the confession even more disturbing.
But the investigators wanted to understand something deeper. Why? What turned this seemingly polite handyman into a predator? Cary began to talk about his childhood. He described growing up in the shadow of his younger brother, Cary Stayner, the boy who had been kidnapped at 7 years old and miraculously escaped 7 years later. Stephen had become a national hero, and Cary, the older brother, had become invisible. For years, he said, he carried resentment, confusion, and a darkness he couldn't control. In his mind, he was overshadowed by a famous victim while secretly battling violent fantasies he never shared with anyone. He talked about mental health issues, obsessive thoughts, and the feeling that he was born to do something terrible. But even as he explained this, detectives noticed something chilling. Cary wasn't asking for forgiveness. He wasn't justifying his actions. He wasn't even emotional. He simply wanted the truth out. His truth. After hours of confession, he calmly asked investigators if they could help him get a good movie deal. The agents stared at him in disbelief. A man who had brutally ended 4 innocent lives was now thinking about fame? That request removed any doubt that Cary Stayner was not only dangerous, he was disturbingly disconnected from humanity. The next step was taking him back to the mountains to locate evidence. Cary sat in the car between 2 agents as they drove through the winding Yosemite roads. He looked out the window as if he were sightseeing. When they arrived near Lake Don Pedro, he pointed to the exact spot where he had left Julie's body months earlier. His memory was perfect. Too perfect. It proved investigators were dealing with someone who had rehearsed his crimes internally long before he carried them out. The agents asked him if he felt any guilt. He said he felt relief because the fantasies were over. That answer sent a cold wave through the team. Relief, not regret, was his only emotion. Once the details were gathered, Cary was booked into federal custody. News of the arrest spread across the country. People who had driven through Yosemite that spring started questioning every moment they had spent near Cedar Lodge. National Park visitors who remembered seeing a quiet handyman fixing broken faucets were now learning the truth. He was watching them more closely than they ever realized. Reporters dug into his past, interviewing family members, old coworkers, and neighbors. Most of them said the same thing. He was quiet. He was polite. He never seemed dangerous. But hindsight changed everything. People recalled moments where something felt off about him. Times when he stared too long or isolated himself in strange ways. Suddenly, the clues seemed obvious, but only after the fact. Inside his jail cell, Cary remained calm. He shaved his head. He meditated. He told guards he felt peaceful for the first time in years. But for the families of the victims, peace was impossible. They were confronted with the horrific reality of what their loved ones endured, and the trial ahead promised to reopen every wound. When Cary Stayner walked into the courtroom for the first time, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Reporters filled every seat, cameras lined the hallways, and families of the victims held tightly to one another as the man who shattered their lives entered in a calm, almost emotionless silence. There was no panic in his eyes, no fear of judgment. He looked like someone who had accepted his identity long before anyone else even suspected him. Prosecutors wasted no time painting the picture of a calculated killer. They presented the jury with Cary's own confession, physical evidence from the crime scenes, and chilling details that even veteran detectives struggled to repeat out loud. The courtroom listened as Cary's voice, recorded during his interview, described every step he took, how he stalked the women, how he restrained them, and how he carried out each murder with methodical precision. The jurors watched him closely, hoping to see some flicker of remorse, but Cary barely reacted. He sat with his hands folded, occasionally glancing around the room as if he were an observer instead of the man responsible for the horror being described.
The defense attempted to shift the focus toward mental illness. They talked about his childhood trauma, growing up in the shadow of his kidnapped and famously rescued younger brother, Cary Stayner. They described a lifetime of untreated psychological issues, obsessive thoughts, and a family environment filled with dysfunction. The defense argued that Cary's mind was damaged long before he ever picked up a weapon. They claimed he needed treatment, not death. But the prosecution countered with a simple, powerful point. Cary prepared for these killings. He planned them. He executed them with intent. And after each murder, he covered his tracks with chilling efficiency. That level of control, they argued, was not the behavior of an unstable man. It was the behavior of someone fully aware of what he was doing. One of the most emotional moments came when the family of 15-year-old Julie Sund took the stand. Her father's voice broke as he described the weeks spent searching for her, praying she would be found alive, and the devastation of learning how much she suffered in her final hours. The jury listened in complete silence, many unable to look away from the grieving parents. Even then, Cary showed almost no reaction. He stared straight ahead, blinking slowly, as though the testimony was happening in another room. Court officers later said he displayed that same detached stillness throughout the entire trial, never crying, never apologizing, never pleading for mercy. When the closing arguments ended, everyone in the courtroom knew what was coming. The evidence was overwhelming. The confession was undeniable. The brutality was unmistakable. It took the jury only a few hours to return with their decision. As they filed back into the courtroom, you could feel the tension thickening the air. Every eye locked onto them as the foreman stood and read the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Cary Stayner, guilty on all counts. Gasps echoed through the room. Some cried. Some simply sighed in relief. And Cary? He didn't even flinch. The sentencing phase was just as intense. Prosecutors demanded the death penalty, arguing that the cruelty he inflicted on 4 innocent women warranted the most severe punishment. They replayed portions of his confession, showed crime scene photos, and reminded the jury of every terrifying detail. The defense again pushed for life in prison, insisting that Cary was mentally ill and shaped by years of unaddressed trauma. But the jury had made up its mind. They returned with a unanimous vote for death. As the judge read the sentence, Cary looked up briefly, almost as if he were acknowledging something he already knew was coming. Then he was escorted out, his face the same blank mask it had been since the moment he confessed. Cary Stayner was transferred to San Quentin's state prison, where he remains on death row. And while he has given interviews over the years, including claiming he felt relief after the murders, he has never expressed genuine remorse. For the families, justice came with the verdict, but healing has been a lifelong journey. Yosemite National Park eventually returned to normal life, but the memory of 1999 remains etched in its history, a reminder that even in the most beautiful places, unimaginable darkness can hide in plain sight. Today, the story of Cary Stayner stands as one of the most haunting examples of a predator no one saw coming, a quiet handyman, a man living in the shadow of a famous tragedy, a killer whose calm exterior concealed a storm of violent fantasies. And in the end, it was not the wilderness of Yosemite that posed the greatest danger. It was the man who walked its trails, fixed its motel rooms, and chose his victims with silent precision. The Yosemite Killer is now locked away forever, but the echoes of his crimes continue to chill anyone who revisits the case, proving that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that look just like everyone else.